And one more short presentation before you stretch your legs for the seventh inning stretch and a little more coffee, and by heck, you're not leaving here hungry. So that's Havie Carter, who is a PhD candidate with Dave Renault and the rest of the team that you see up here. Havie is a two-time University of Guelph grad so far, soon to be 3. She's worked in the industry with Trow for several years and is now back doing her PhD around KTT, because again, today is one of the many things we all try to do really good research, but as importantly, to get it out to people who can and should and hopefully want to and will use it. And so part of Havie's PhD is doing some of the science of better understanding what the needs are, what the best ways are to deliver, in this case, both to dairy producers and veterinarians. The floor is yours, Havie.
How lucky am I to be between you guys and a snack? So I'll try and keep this brief. So like Stephen said, my name is Havie Carter. I'm co-advised by Dr. Dave Renault here and also Caroline Ritter at the University of Prince Edward Island. You guys all look really comfy. Maybe you need a stretch. So I want you to raise your hand if you believe education is valuable. Good, I'm glad I saw lots of hands come up. Let's take it a step further. Who here prefers virtual KTT, podcasts, webinars, online courses? Crickets. Who here prefers in-person KTT like what we're doing today? Right, okay, so if we as KTT deliverers believe that what we're sharing is valuable, we need to make sure that our audience also feels the same way. And through my research, we found that both producers and veterinarians do think that in-person KTT is highly valuable and likely favored, but these two groups have two things, if not more, in common. They are spread out in rural areas, and they have very tight time budgets. So we're trying to cater to an audience that is not always accessible to us, and because of that, we need to find strategies in how we can actually make KTT attractive for them. So that brings me to my research. As of right now, we've done 2 focus group studies, one with veterinarians, one with producers, both about the perceptions of barriers associated with the uptake of educational programs. I will focus on producers today, but I'll highlight a couple of similarities and differences between the 2 groups. With 20 participating producers from Southern Ontario, 13 identified as male and 7 as female, median age was 37.5 years old, and most of the participants own their own operations. Most operated in an automated milking system, followed by parlors and tie stalls. Median herd size was just under 100 animals, and most participants indicated that they had a post-secondary degree. For the participating veterinarians, 12 identified as male, 8 as female. Median age was 49 years old. Median years practicing was 19, and 13 were mixed dairy veterinarians, and 13 were dairy veterinarians, and 17 were mixed animal practitioners. So for the purpose of our studies, we've identified an educational program as virtual or in person, and it can be done as a group or individually, as long as the program's purpose is to provide new or valuable information from a reputable source. And through applied thematic analysis, we found 3 themes within the dairy producer focus group data: effective outreach, perception of education, and considerations for participation. And I think we can all agree that if we want to increase the uptake of educational programs, we need to reach the audience. And through these discussions, we ended up separating outreach into 2 categories. So traditional advertising would be like flyers or in-person communication, whereas digital could be anything from a phone call to a social media advertisement, text message, email, anything like that. These were highly varied with preferences among the different producers, but they all agreed that they'd be more inclined to go to something if they got a personal invitation. What I thought was kind of interesting is that in-person invitations, text messages, and phone calls were all considered to be equally as valuable, but there was an added benefit of text message serving as a reminder after the fact. All of the participants did agree that education is valuable, so the same page as everybody here today, which is great. It can serve as an outlet for personal and professional growth, but it also is a catalyst for change. And in an industry where we continue to learn and best management practices become updated, producers need to be able to have something that supports that change within their businesses. It does bring new and novel information, but it can also serve as a reminder for previously taught and potentially adhered to practices that may have slipped on certain farms. I also think it's really important to note that there's a fear factor associated with admitting knowledge gaps. And many participants criticized previously attended KTT for having an assumption that they may have had a basic understanding of the bottom knowledge, and that's not the case. So the other thing to note here is that these participants shared that they would not be comfortable asking for elaboration in a group setting. So what does motivate producers? Social interaction, especially for in-person KTT, a motivation to improve their operations, and the content has to be applicable to them. Dairy farming is kind of a head down and somewhat lonely task. You go around the same field year after year, and you call that success. Dairy farming can be isolating, and that's why in-person KTT can provide a break from the farm and an opportunity to engage with other people doing the same thing as them. And in some cases, the content of the KTT is good, but the discussion is better. A couple of other notable findings here is that peer learning is an opportunity to provide validation and guidance from others with shared experiences. And participants also noted that educational programs with a smaller number of participants help to improve applicability and interaction, which supported a deeper understanding of the topic. Now, when it comes to barriers, there are several internal and external barriers that were discussed. Time, location, if in person, were huge barriers to attendance. Cost was kind of interesting. Participants shared that if there was a registration fee associated with an educational program, they perceived it to be of a higher value. But if they weren't genuinely interested in the topic, they were discouraged. Now, when it comes to internal barriers, producers have to be willing to learn. They need to see value in the content. But there's also some multi-generational differences on farms that can impact uptake. There's a couple of things here. There's a lot of factors ingrained within this barrier. Many producers run their farms in tandem with another generation of their family, whether that's children, parents, or grandparents. And there's a sense of a duty to respect their elders by the younger generation, and also fear of judgment by the older generation who may not perceive that program to be valuable. And these are both associated with the barrier of multi-generational differences. I would say that the generational gap is a big one that our farm struggles with. How do you bridge the gap between doing things the old way and your way, but then going to seminars, learning about something new, but also being respectful to the older generation? Now, when it comes to veterinarians, their motivators for attending KTT or continued education is very similar to producers. Personal growth, improving for the client, which I would say is professional growth, and again, applicability of the content. External barriers, resource barriers, time, location, financial constraints. They also noted a couple of other things though. They criticized previously attended CE with leaving them with a sense of uncertainty. So lack of a key message or clear conclusion that they could actually applicably and practically take home to their clients. There were also some current concerns associated with perceived biases from commercially supported CE. And this one was from French-speaking veterinarians, where translations between English and French KTT is not always well done and could be done better. So there's clearly some hurdles to the uptake of KTT by these two groups. There's also barriers between KTT from veterinarians to producers, and even the other way around. Self-awareness, social awareness, empathy, these are all traits that are highly important for developing a strong relationship. They're really hard to learn, and they're very difficult to teach. So, as a result, both of the groups sense that there's a perceived lack of emotional intelligence and communication skills. And that leads directly into the next point of an increasing producer-veterinarian disconnect. Again, both groups focused on this, but for different reasons. So veterinarians shared a concern of many different outlets that producers have access to gain information, and it doesn't necessarily always go through them. So they get to farm and they see that the producers have tried something new and they had no idea about it. Or technological advances on farm allowing producers to limit the frequency of calling their vet for help, which is good in a sense. They say, okay, well, this is going to save me money, but it's ultimately reduced the strength of the relationship between the two groups. And veterinarians have discussed a phenomenon that I have termed advisor fatigue. And I think that this can be extrapolated into the broader advisor on farm. So you go to farm, you have a solution, you have advice, and then you see no change from it. And what this is leading to is veterinarians changing their expectations of their clients or reducing the amount of KTT initiatives that they're bringing to the farm. And if you look at this at a bigger picture and consider these pieces of the puzzle, what you're seeing is a deterioration of trust between the two groups. And what this is going to lead to is a lack of influence that the veterinarian has on that farm. So, considering that I've said that there's no key messages and clear conclusions from the KTT initiatives we have, I want to share some tips that you can take home to your practices. What is the best KTT strategy? You've understood now that I would say in-person KTT is typically favored by both groups, with the added benefit of small group meetings being a little bit more interactive. When it comes to asynchronous and virtual KTT, written content is usually favored. Podcasts and webinars were typically criticized for being difficult to focus on and not very engaging, particularly by producers. Veterinarians are the most influential advisor on farm. So if you can find a way to integrate them into the development or delivery of KTT, that will be valued by producers and should support uptake. Now, if you're creating CE for veterinarians with the hopes that some of that information might trickle down to their clients, consider creating resources that the veterinarians can give directly to their clients instead of expecting them to do it themselves. And don't forget that peer learning is also highly valued by dairy producers. So try to involve them into the development and delivery. You could consider something like benchmarking. It's a great way to help the audience individualize general topics from a large lecture-style meeting. Or integrating producer testimonials or stories of shared experiences about a product or a topic that you're talking about. Typically, producers prefer to be a follower than a leader when it comes to making a change on farm. And last but not least, a couple of KTT tips for effective communication. We, as KTT deliverers, have a lot of information that we want to share, but don't do it. As soon as you lose focus from your key concepts, you're going to lose your audience. And that's why it's so important that you know who your audience is. Because if you're talking to someone in research versus a producer, you're going to spin your story differently. You have to. For a producer, you lead with a story, catch their attention, and then you land with science. Okay, so how deep into the science do you actually go? Because you can go pretty far. Just don't assume. Always ask. Because if you're not listening and asking, you're not translating the information, you're just transmitting it. And you're still not done. The follow-up is just as important as the initial KTT delivery. Consider the first conversation as planting the seed, and the follow-up is what helps it grow. I want to take a second to thank my funders, as well as my participants for both my focus group studies. There's a couple in the room, so I want to make sure that they're heard here today. And with that, I want to thank you for listening.